When my grandmother died, the woman who taught our entire town what it meant to give without asking for anything back, my parents didn't show up to say goodbye. They showed up with a lawyer. They came 3 weeks later with papers that said I was a thief. They told everyone I tricked an old lady into giving me everything she owned. I didn't fight back with angry words. I didn't cry in front of them. I knew something they forgot. My grandma wrote down the truth in places they never thought to look. Before we continue, please click the subscribe button and write in the comments what country you're watching from. I love reading every single one. My name is Maya Chin. I'm 32 years old. I work as a teacher in a small school in Oregon. I was born in a hospital in Portland, but I grew up somewhere very different. If someone asks me when my real life started, I wouldn't point to the day I was born. I would point to a small yellow house near the mountains where a kind woman with soft hands taught me that family isn't always the people who share your blood. Portland feels like a place from a dream now. The tall buildings, the busy streets, the sounds of cars honking all day long. That's where I came from. But it's not where I learned to be me. My father, David Chen, used to work in big offices. He wore fancy suits and talked about important meetings. My mother, Linda Chen, wrote stories for magazines. She traveled to different cities every month. They lived fast lives. I was too slow for them. My grandmother told me that when I was only 2 years old, they brought me to her house with one small bag. They said they needed a few weeks to fix some problems. They promised they would come back soon. That promise broke. The glass. They never returned. They didn't call. They didn't write letters. They just disappeared into their busy lives and forgot about the little girl they left behind. But that day, the day they left me, was the day my real family found me. I grew up with my grandparents. Grandma Rose Chen was a nurse who worked at the hospital for 40 years. Everyone in town knew her name. She helped babies come into the world. She held people's hands when they were scared. My grandpa, Henry Chen, was quiet and gentle. He fixed broken things. Bikes, toys, hearts. Their house wasn't big or expensive, even though Grandma Rose saved money for many years. But it felt like the safest place in the whole world. Grandma Rose was known all over our town for her kindness. She was short and round, with gray hair she kept in a bun. When she walked into a room, people smiled. At home, she was even more special. She sang old songs while cooking dinner. She read me stories every night before bed. She told me that being kind was more important than being powerful. Grandpa Henry made our home feel peaceful. He built me a treehouse in the backyard. He taught me how to plant seeds and watch them grow. When I had bad dreams, he sat next to my bed until I fell asleep again. I grew up watching Grandma Rose get ready for work every morning. She always wore clean white shoes and carried a blue bag. She checked everything twice to make sure she didn't forget anything important. She never said mean things about my parents, but she never made excuses for them either. One night when I was old enough to ask why they never came back, she sat down next to me and said something I'll never forget. "Some people only think about themselves," she said. "Other people choose to think about what's right. You were chosen to be here with us." After she said that, I didn't feel sad anymore. Felt lucky. I didn't know that many years later, after Grandma Rose died, my parents would come back. But they wouldn't come to say sorry. They would come to take things that didn't belong to them. I didn't know that an old notebook Grandma Rose kept hidden would become the thing that proved the truth to everyone. Every good story starts quiet. Mine started in that yellow house, long before the storm came. Growing up in that house meant learning things without anyone having to yell. Grandma Rose never raised her voice. She didn't need to. When she looked at you, you wanted to be better. When she spoke, you remembered her words for years. But with me, she was patient and soft in ways most people never saw. Every morning she woke up when it was still dark outside. I could hear her feet walking across the floor. I could hear her pouring coffee into her favorite cup. I could hear papers moving as she read before work. She told me once that being ready for the day was important. She said, "If you don't prepare, mistakes happen. Don't let that be you." Those words stayed in my head forever. Grandpa Henry was different. He showed love by doing things. He believed you had to practice being kind every single day, like watering flowers or feeding the dog. He taught me how to know when plants needed water just by touching the dirt. He said people were the same way. Pay attention, he would whisper. Hurt doesn't always make noise. I was a quiet kid. I wasn't shy. I just liked to watch and learn. I learned by watching Grandma Rose work late at night, her reading glasses sliding down her nose as she looked at papers. I learned by watching Grandpa Henry hum songs while he folded clothes. And sometimes late at night, I looked out the window at the empty driveway, hoping to see car lights coming toward our house. They never came. When I was about 7 years old, I got brave enough to ask. I was sitting with Grandma Rose at the kitchen table. We were playing a card game. My hand was shaking as I held my cards. I asked her why my parents never called me. She didn't look shocked. She didn't get upset. She just looked into my eyes and waited until I was ready to hear what she had to say. Your parents weren't ready to love someone who needed them, she said in a calm voice. That wasn't your fault then. It's not your fault now. I asked if they would ever come back. Maybe, she said. But love that only shows up when it wants something isn't real love. Don't forget that. That night I cried into my pillow. Grandpa Henry heard me. He came into my room and sat on my bed. He didn't say everything would be okay. He just promised I wouldn't be alone. And he kept that promise every day after that. School became the place I felt safe. I worked hard in class. Not because anyone forced me. I did it because I wanted to make the people who chose me feel proud. Every good test score felt like saying thank you without using words. Grandma Rose never made a big deal when I did well. She would just nod her head, smile a little, and say, doing things right every day matters more than being perfect one time. As I got older, I started noticing things changing. Grandpa Henry got tired more easily. Grandma Rose sat in her chair longer, staring at the garden she loved. Time was taking pieces of them. Slowly. I didn't understand how fragile everything was. I just knew I felt protected. That feeling broke the day my parents came back. I was doing homework at the kitchen table when someone knocked on the door. The knock was loud and demanding. Grandma Rose went stiff. Grandpa Henry's hands started shaking. When Grandma Rose opened the door, I saw them. They were older, but I still knew who they were. My heart didn't jump with happiness. Sank like a stone. They hugged me the way strangers hug each other. Quick, awkward, empty. They talked about losing money and making bad choices. They spoke, fast and nervous. Then they asked Grandma Rose for money. That was the first time I realized something awful. They didn't come for me. After that first visit, the quietness in our house felt different. It wasn't calm anymore. It felt tense, like everyone was holding their breath and waiting for something bad. My parents started showing up more and more. They never called first. They always acted the same way. They smiled fake smiles and said nice things that meant nothing. Every visit was the same pattern, and I learned to see it coming. Polite hellos, forced laughs. Then excuses about why they needed help. David talked about jobs he almost got. Linda talked about editors who didn't appreciate her work anymore. Their voices sounded practiced and smooth, but their eyes never stayed on me for long. They looked past me toward Grandma Rose, toward the house, toward the life they walked away from. Grandma Rose always listened without interrupting. She did that with everyone. She helped them more than once. Not because she believed what they said, but because she didn't want me to see cruelty in my own home. Grandpa Henry would make tea with shaking hands. His smile looked painful. His eyes begged for peace. I started understanding something that hurt. My parents weren't mean in loud, obvious ways. They were mean by leaving, by not caring, by choosing themselves over and over again. One night after they left, I found Grandma Rose sitting alone in the living room. The lamp made shadows on her face. She looked older than I'd ever seen her. Not weak, just tired in a way sleep couldn't fix. They only come when they want something, I said quietly. She nodded once. Yes. Why do you still help them? Yes. She looked at me. really looked at me. Because being angry is easy, she said. And easy things usually don't lead anywhere good. I didn't fully understand what she meant then. But I would later. The arguments got worse over time. David stopped pretending to be polite. He started demanding instead of asking. One evening his voice cut through the house like broken glass. He yelled at Grandma Rose. He said she chose me over him. He said she cared more about strangers than her own son. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening to something beautiful break apart. You left her, Grandma Rose said, in a quiet but firm voice. I didn't steal her from you. Silence. Then a door slammed so hard the walls shook. That was the first time I saw Grandpa Henry cry without trying to hide it. Not long after that, everything fell apart. It happened on a cold night when the wind made the windows rattle. My parents came over again. The argument got loud faster than before. Grandpa Henry tried to calm everyone down. His voice was thin and strained. Then he stopped talking in the middle of a sentence. His hand grabbed his chest. Time stopped. I remember the sound of his body hitting the floor. I remember Grandma Rose screaming his name. I remember David just standing there, looking annoyed, before he turned and walked out like this was just an inconvenience. The ambulance came with flashing red lights. At the hospital we sat in terrible silence. When the doctor finally came out, I knew before he spoke. Grandpa Henry was gone. The house never felt the same. Grandma Rose didn't either. She stopped working soon after. She said someone who couldn't protect. The people they loved shouldn't be trusted to care for strangers. She spent her days in the garden Grandpa Henry built, touching the leaves like she hoped they would bring him back. I stayed with her. I learned how to be strong without making noise. I learned that love can break your heart and still be worth everything. Years later, when Grandma Rose passed away peacefully in her favorite chair with an old notebook in her hands, I thought the pain had finally reached its end. I was wrong. Because sadness was followed by greed. And that's when everything changed. The days after Grandma Rose Chen died felt like walking through fog. I couldn't see clearly. Everything looked the same but nothing felt right. Our small town in Oregon looked normal, but I felt empty inside like someone had scooped out my heart. I planned the funeral by myself. I picked flowers that Grandpa Henry would have grown in his garden. I chose songs that Grandma Rose used to hum while she cooked. I stood in a black dress under a sky that was too bright and cheerful for such a sad day. The church filled with people from all over town. Nurses who worked with Grandma Rose. Families whose babies she helped deliver. People she cared for when they were sick. People she comforted when they were scared. They talked about how kind she was, how fair. How she always believed in protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. I sat and listened, my hands squeezed together so tight they hurt. My parents showed up late. They were dressed in expensive clothes like they were going to a fancy party instead of a funeral. David's suit looked brand new. Linda stood perfectly straight. They didn't cry. They didn't even pretend to be sad. Instead, their eyes moved around the room, looking at things, counting things. I felt something cold fill my chest. They didn't come to say goodbye. They came to see what they could take. 2 weeks later, I sat in the office of Mr. Robert Mills. He was Grandma Rose's lawyer and old friend. The room smelled like old books and wood polish. Sunlight came through big windows, making dust float in the air. My parents sat across from me. Their faces looked tight with excitement. I kept my eyes on the floor, trying to breathe normally. Mr. Mills read the will slowly and clearly. Every word felt heavy and final. Grandma Rose Chen's money, her house, her land, and all her savings, which was $13 million, was left completely to me. The room went silent. Then everything exploded. David jumped up from his chair. His face turned red with anger. Linda's fingers dug into the arms of her chair like claws. Mr. Mills kept reading. His voice stayed calm. He said that Grandma Rose left David one thing only. An old notebook. David laughed in a mean way. He grabbed the notebook from the desk and threw it on the floor. Like it was garbage. He shouted that he would sue me. He said I tricked an old woman. He said he wouldn't let this happen. Then, just like always, they left. This time they took something with them. My reputation. Within days, people started talking. Whispers turned into stories in the newspaper. Headlines said I was a young teacher who took advantage of her own grandmother. They said I manipulated her, controlled her, stole from her. The school where I worked asked me to take time off to avoid problems. I packed my things from my desk while my co-workers watched, not knowing if they should comfort me or stay away. The lawsuit papers arrived in a stiff envelope, cold and official. My parents accused me of tricking Grandma Rose when she was old and confused. They said I kept her away from them. They said I changed her mind to steal $13 million. They hired a lawyer with a fake smile and cold eyes. The court gave the case to Judge William Torres. The day I walked into that courtroom and saw him sitting at the judge's bench, my chest felt tight. He had worked with Grandma Rose years ago. I remembered him from when I was little. He once bent down to talk to me and said that being fair was never easy but always important. Now he would decide if Grandma Rose's last wish would be honored. As the trial started, my parents made me sound like a villain, a liar, a person who hurt an old lady to get rich. I sat still and listened. I didn't argue. I let the truth do the talking. Because I had something they forgot about. The notebook. And every page had Grandma Rose's handwriting. Her thoughts, her love, and her truth. The trial moved slowly, carefully, like a game of chess Grandma Rose would have understood. Every word mattered. Every pause carried weight. My parents' lawyer spoke with confidence. He told a story that sounded believable on the surface. He said Grandma Rose had been lonely in her final years. He said I was the only person around her. He said grief and old age confused her. I sat quietly with my hands folded, breathing slowly and steadily. I learned a long time ago that reacting too fast only makes things worse. Witnesses came to speak. Old neighbors. Distant cousins who barely knew our family. They talked in unclear ways about how often they saw me and how rarely they saw my parents. None of it proved I did anything wrong, but doubt I was learning didn't need proof to feel heavy in the air. Then it was my turn. Mr. Mills stood up and walked toward the judge. He asked permission to show everyone Grandma Rose's personal notebook. People in the courtroom started whispering. My parents became stiff and tense. David's jaw got tight. Linda looked down at the table. Experts had checked the handwriting. Doctors had already said Grandma Rose's mind was perfectly clear until the day she died. Every requirement was met. Judge William Torres nodded once. The notebook was allowed. Mr. Mills didn't rush. He opened it carefully like the pages were precious. He read entries Grandma Rose wrote years before she died. Notes about her work at the hospital. Thoughts about fairness. Observations about my parents. She wrote about disappointment without being cruel. She wrote about love without being blind. She said David was her son, but she named his choices clearly. She wrote that leaving someone behind wasn't the same as being free. She wrote that running away from responsibility wasn't bravery. Then Mr. Mills read the part that changed everything. Grandma Rose wrote that she trusted me. Not because I was her granddaughter, but because I understood patience, responsibility, and truth. She wrote that money meant nothing without honesty. She wrote that $13 million in careless hands could cause more harm than good. The courtroom went completely silent. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't need to. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not relief exactly, but clarity. Grandma Rose was speaking again, just like she always did. Calm, strong, fair. The defense lawyer tried to object. He said the notebook was emotional and biased. Judge Torres overruled him. He said he needed time to review all the evidence carefully. Court was dismissed for the day. As people left, I stayed in my seat. My hands shook for the first time. Not from fear, but from finally being able to let go of everything I'd been holding inside. Outside, the Oregon sunlight felt strange on my face. Reporters waited outside, shouting questions I ignored. I walked past them, holding the notebook close to my chest. That night, alone in the old yellow house, I sat in Grandma Rose's favorite chair. I read her words again by lamplight. She knew this might happen. She prepared for it. Not to punish her son, but to protect the truth. The verdict would come soon. And whatever happened, I knew one thing for certain. Grandma Rose Chen had never been confused about who I was. And I wasn't confused either. The days before the verdict felt longer than any school year I'd ever taught. Time moved in weird ways. Sometimes it dragged. Sometimes it disappeared without me noticing. I went back to the yellow house every evening. The same house where I grew up. The same walls that still held memories of Grandpa Henry's laughter and Grandma Rose's gentle footsteps. Without them, the rooms felt too big and too empty. I tried to keep busy with normal things. I cooked food I couldn't taste. I cleaned shelves that were already clean. At night I sat by the window and watched the wind move through the trees, listening to silence fill the spaces where voices used to be. I thought about the little girl I used to be. The one who sat on the floor playing cards, believing her grandma would always be there. She was still there, just in a different way. News about the lawsuit spread everywhere. Neighbors who used to wave at me now looked away. Other people stopped me at the grocery store to squeeze my hand and whisper that Grandma Rose would be proud. I learned quickly how easily people's opinions could change. How fast truth could turn into gossip when sadness and money mixed together. My parents stayed hidden. No phone calls. No messages. Only their lawyer spoke for them, filing more papers, asking for delays, trying to make everything take as long as possible. I recognized what they were doing. Making justice wait can feel like denying justice when you're the one living through it. On the morning the trial started again, the courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the front steps. Camera flashes went off everywhere. I kept my head up and my back straight, remembering how Grandma Rose used to walk into places. Calm, unbothered, certain. Inside, Judge William Torres sat down at his bench. He looked tired, older than he had looked days before. His eyes moved across the room. He looked at me briefly, then at my parents. There was no friendliness, only seriousness. He spoke slowly, reviewing the facts. The medical reports that proved Grandma Rose's mind was clear and sharp. The timeline of when she wrote her will. The notebook entries. The accusations. The lack of evidence supporting them. When he reached his decision, everyone in the courtroom stopped breathing. The claims made by David and Linda Chen were dismissed completely. Grandma Rose Chen's will was valid and legal. The inheritance belonged to me. A wave of whispers rippled through the room. I felt a strange calmness wash over me, like the quiet after a storm finally ends. My parents sat completely still. David stared at the table. Linda's mouth pressed into a thin line. Her perfect posture finally cracked. Judge Torres added one more sentence before he hit his wooden hammer on the desk. Being fair doesn't belong to people just because they're related by blood, he said. It belongs to the truth. The sound echoed longer than it should have. As people left the courtroom, I gathered my things slowly. Held the notebook. Its worn leather cover felt warm under my fingers. David didn't look at me at first. When I stepped closer, he finally raised his eyes. They weren't angry anymore. They were empty. You should read it, I said quietly, holding the notebook out toward him. Not to make yourself feel better. Just to understand her. For a moment he hesitated. Then his hand reached out, shaky and uncertain, and took it. He nodded once. No words came after that. None were needed. Outside, Oregon's sunlight wrapped around me like a warm blanket. I stood on the courthouse steps, feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. The trial was over. But healing, I knew, didn't follow verdicts on a schedule. The days after the verdict felt quieter than I expected. Not peaceful exactly, just subdued, like the whole town had let out a long breath and didn't know what to do next. Our small town moved on quickly the way small towns do. But pieces of the trial stayed behind in sideways looks and half-finished conversations at the market. What surprised me most was how the attention shifted. People stopped whispering about me and started whispering about my parents. At the weekend farmers market, vendors who had known Grandma Rose for decades spoke openly now. I heard my father's name said with disappointment instead of respect. Once, while buying apples, an old woman touched my shoulder and said softly, "You have her spirit. She would be so proud." Then she shook her head and added, "Some people don't deserve the good things they're born with." My parents felt it too. They were no longer welcome the way they used to be. Old friends avoided them. Party invitations stopped coming. Even people in the medical community, who once respected the Chen name because of Grandma Rose, turned cold toward them. Her former co-workers didn't hide their disapproval. To them, the lawsuit wasn't just about money. It was an insult to a woman who spent her whole life caring for others. I didn't feel happy about any of it, only sad. They created their own loneliness, and I was left standing in the ruins of what could have been different. I tried to focus on work again once the school let me come back. Returning to my classroom felt strange, like walking into a familiar room that smelled different after something burned. Students waited for me. Real kids with real problems. I reminded myself why I became a teacher in the first place. One of my first days back, a young girl got in trouble for writing on the school wall. She stood in front of me with shaking hands and red, puffy eyes. She could barely talk through her tears. She hadn't done it to be mean. She did it because she was scared and didn't know how else to express her feelings. The facts told a bigger story than the rules she broke. I talked to the principal. I said she needed help, not punishment. The principal agreed. When the girl found out she wouldn't be expelled, she looked at me like I'd opened a door she thought was locked forever. That look stayed with me longer than any newspaper headline ever did. Another case involved a boy who stole lunch money from other kids. But when I talked to him, I found out his family didn't have enough food at home. He was hungry and embarrassed. The rule was clear, but fairness demanded I see the whole picture. I talked to social services. They helped his family. The principal agreed to let him stay in school. Each time something like this happened, I felt Grandma Rose next to me, not telling me what to do but helping my heart stay steady. Late one evening, tired from a long day, I came home and opened the notebook again. Some pages had been torn long ago and then carefully taped back together. I traced the ink with my fingers, reading passages again about responsibility, patience, and love that didn't need anything in return. Then my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized. I almost didn't answer, but something told me I should. "Hello," said. There was a pause. Then a voice I hadn't heard without anger in many years spoke quietly. "Maya," my father said. "I read it. All of it." The room suddenly felt smaller. "I wasn't the man she believed I could be," he continued. "And I wasn't the father you deserved." I didn't interrupt. "I'm not asking you to forgive me," he said. "I just wanted you to know. She never stopped loving me, even when I gave her every reason to stop." Closed my eyes. "That's who she was," I said softly. We said goodbye without making any promises. When the call ended, I didn't feel healed completely, but I felt lighter. Being fair, I was learning didn't always mean getting closure. Sometimes it just meant honesty arriving late but still arriving. After that phone call, I sat in silence for a long time. The notebook rested open on my lap. My apartment felt unfamiliar, like it was still deciding whether to welcome me back into it. Outside, Oregon slept under a sky full of stars that didn't care about verdicts, phone calls, or confessions that came too late. I didn't call my father back. Not because I was mad, but because I understood something important. Healing didn't mean rushing toward forgiveness. It meant letting truth settle without forcing it to become something it wasn't ready to be. Grandma Rose always believed that timing mattered just as much as intention. Work became my safe place again. I returned fully to the rhythm of my classroom, the quiet focus of preparing lessons, the careful language of parent meetings and school assemblies. Every student in my class represented a life crossing paths with rules and fairness, and I treated each one with the same care Grandma Rose taught me. Some situations were small, easy to overlook. To me, they were reminders of why fairness mattered. An elderly crossing guard accused of being too slow by impatient drivers. A teenager caught skipping school after his mom got sick. None of them fit neatly into ideas of right or wrong. Fairness never did. Late nights became normal. I would leave school after the sun went down, the hallways echoing softly behind me. Sometimes I imagined Grandma Rose walking those halls beside me, her steps unhurried, her presence steady. I wondered if this was how she felt when she was younger, still believing that caring for people could make a real difference if done carefully enough. At home, the old yellow house stayed the same. I hadn't sold it. Couldn't. It held too much of who I was. I kept the garden alive even when the dirt was stubborn and dry. I planted new flowers next to the ones Grandpa Henry once loved, unsure if I was honoring him or just afraid to let go. One afternoon, while cleaning out a drawer in Grandma Rose's bedroom, I found an envelope I'd never seen before. My name was written on it in her neat handwriting. Inside was a single letter. She wrote that she worried about what the world would do to me once she was gone. She said that being right didn't always mean being safe. She warned me that doing the right thing often came with loneliness, but that loneliness was better than betraying who you truly were. She wrote that she hoped I would never confuse fairness with revenge. I folded the letter carefully and put it back where it belonged. Some lessons weren't meant to be carried everywhere. They were meant to be returned to when you needed them. My parents stayed far away. I heard through other people that they were getting ready to leave Oregon. There were no big goodbyes, no final arguments, just a quiet withdrawal, like the town itself had gently shown them the door. I didn't chase after them. Instead, I focused on building something that would last longer than anger. Months passed. The whispers faded. New stories replaced the old ones. And slowly, without any ceremony, my life settled into something steady. Not easy, not perfect, but honest. One evening as I locked up the yellow house and stepped onto the front porch, the wind carried the familiar smell of pine trees and earth. I looked up at the sky and whispered a thank you to no one and everyone at once. I was still walking the path Grandma Rose had shown me, and for the first time since her death, I felt certain I was going the right way. As time kept moving forward, I began to understand something Grandma Rose never said out loud but lived every single day. Being fair wasn't a one-time thing. It wasn't a verdict, a decision, or a final word spoken in a courtroom. It was something you practiced, a way of showing up when it would be easier to walk away. My work showed that more clearly with every passing month. There was a young boy accused of starting a fight at school. His record already had too many bad marks. On paper he looked like trouble. But when I looked closer, I saw a pattern of neglect, not evil. He'd been moved from foster home to foster home. He slept on couches. He learned early that surviving meant protecting yourself first. I didn't excuse what he did. I explained it. I recommended he get counseling instead of suspension. The principal listened and agreed. Another situation involved an old man accused of lying on forms to keep his house. The rule was clear. So was his fear. He'd lived in that house for 50 years. His wife had passed away there. The thought of losing it had made him desperate. I stood in the principal's office and said what Grandma Rose would have said. Rules must be strong, I told him. But they must also be human. Each time I said those words, I felt the weight of Grandma Rose's example on my shoulders. Not as something heavy that dragged me down, but as a responsibility I had chosen to carry. Outside of school, my life stayed quiet. I didn't chase awards or recognition. I didn't do interviews. I said no to invitations that felt fake or showy. Instead, I spent my evenings reading, cooking simple meals, and taking care of the old yellow house. I fixed broken steps. I repainted the fence. I learned that caring for a place was another way of honoring the people who loved it first. Sometimes I thought of my parents. Not with anger anymore, but with a distant, careful sadness. I wondered if they had found peace wherever they went, or if peace still felt like something they thought they deserved without working for it. I stopped asking myself if they would ever come back. Some doors, once closed, didn't need to be reopened to be respected. One afternoon I got a handwritten note in the mail from Judge William Torres. It was short. He thanked me for acting with dignity during the trial. He wrote that Grandma Rose would have been proud, not of the outcome but of the way I carried myself through the conflict. I read that note more than once. That evening I took the notebook from the shelf and opened it to a random page. Grandma Rose had written about a case at the hospital she once handled wrong. A decision that got overturned. She wrote not about frustration but about thinking deeply. She questioned her own reasoning. She admitted her mistakes. She reminded herself that being too certain was dangerous when you didn't examine yourself. That page changed something in me. I realized that honoring her example didn't mean being perfect. It meant being willing to question myself, to stay open, to accept that being fair required humility as much as strength. As the sun set behind the mountains, I closed the notebook and put it back in its place. I walked outside and watched the light fade from the sky, feeling grounded in a way I hadn't felt before. I wasn't living in her shadow. I was walking forward, guided by what she left behind. And for the first time that felt like enough. There were moments, usually late at night, when the quiet felt heavier than normal. Those were the times when memories came without warning. A laugh from long ago. The sound of Grandpa Henry building something in the garage. Grandma Rose clearing her throat before saying something important. Grief didn't announce itself anymore. It showed up softly, like a familiar visitor who didn't need to knock. I learned not to fight. Instead, I let those moments remind me why I kept going. One evening after a tiring day at school, I came back to the old yellow house and found myself standing in Grandma Rose's bedroom again. Her small desk was exactly as she left it. Pens lined up. Papers stacked neatly. Everything in order. I sat in her chair for the first time since she died, half expecting to feel like I didn't belong there. I didn't feel that way. I felt connected. I thought about the young girl I used to be. Left behind without explanation. Raised not with toys and fancy things but with lessons and intention. Grandma Rose never spoiled me. She prepared me. She taught me that love without rules was empty, and rules without love were cruel. That balance shaped everything I became. My reputation at school began to change. Teachers didn't talk about the lawsuit anymore. They talked about my judgment, my calmness. Some jokingly called me the heart of the school. I smiled politely and kept working. Titles didn't matter. Results did. One afternoon a retired nurse pulled me aside. She said she worked with Grandma Rose years ago. She told me Grandma Rose once corrected her in front of other nurses. Not to embarrass her, but to teach her to be more careful. She laughed as she remembered. Then she looked at me seriously. "She would have been so proud of you," she said. I thanked her, but inside something tightened. Pride was complicated. I didn't need to earn it. I needed to live in a way that honored it. Outside of work, life stayed simple. I didn't rush into relationships. I didn't chase distractions or noise. I found comfort in routines. Morning walks, evening reading, occasional dinners with people who valued quiet conversations over loud ones. Oregon felt like home again. Not because it forgot the past but because it made space for the present. Sometimes while walking through town I noticed small things that felt like signs. A dandelion growing through a crack in the sidewalk. A child holding her grandfather's hand outside the library. A breeze that smelled like rain before clouds came. I stopped asking what my life would have been like if my parents had stayed. That question no longer helped me. What mattered was what I'd been given instead. 50 lessons. Love that didn't leave. Grandma Rose once wrote that what you pass down to others isn't measured by money, but by what you're trusted to carry forward. Standing there, breathing in the cool evening air, I finally understood what she meant. The $13 million had changed my life in practical ways. But her lessons had shaped my soul. And that was the gift no court could ever touch or take away. As the months passed, I began to notice how quietly life rewards being consistent. Not with clapping or trophies, but with steadiness. With a feeling that when you wake up each morning, you know who you are and why you do what you do. That certainty became my foundation. The inheritance sat untouched for a long time. $13 million is a number that can change your priorities if you let it. Grandma Rose had warned me about that in her notebook. Money, she wrote, was a tool, not a trophy. It could protect people or ruin them depending on whose hands held it. So I waited. I met with people who understood money. Asked questions. I refused shortcuts or quick fixes. Eventually I made choices she would have approved of. I put some into funds for students who couldn't afford college. I gave money to programs that helped sick people who couldn't pay for medicine. Quiet help without plaques or announcements. Being fair, she taught me. Didn't need an audience or applause. Kept my teaching job. Some people thought I would quit. That money would free me from working. They didn't understand. The work was never about needing money. It was about purpose. I stayed because I wanted to. Because every student reminded me that fairness only survives when people choose to protect it every single day. One case stayed with me especially. A teenage girl was accused of hitting another student after being bullied for months. The facts were messy. The stories conflicted. As I listened, I saw myself at her age. Quiet, watchful, unwilling to make trouble until trouble forced itself on her. I recommended the charges be dropped with required counseling. The principal agreed. When the girl's father hugged me outside the office, I felt something shift inside me. Not pride exactly. Alignment. The feeling that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. That night I came home and opened the notebook again. I found an entry Grandma Rose wrote shortly after Grandpa Henry died. She wrote about loneliness, about how grief changes the shape of your days. But she also wrote about hope, about how love doesn't disappear, just transforms. Reading her words, I realized something important. I spent years thinking my strength came from surviving being left behind. But my real strength came from being loved well by people who chose to stay. That understanding softened parts of me I didn't know were still guarded. Sometimes I thought of my father, of his voice on the phone, of the way his words shook when he talked about regret. I didn't reach out again, but I no longer avoided thinking about him. I accepted that some relationships heal in pieces, not all at once. Grandma Rose never asked me to forgive blindly. She asked me to understand. As winter changed into spring, the garden behind the yellow house began to wake up. New growth appeared next to old roots. I spent afternoons there with my hands in the dirt, remembering Grandpa Henry's lessons about patience, about letting things grow at their own speed. Standing there one evening, dirt under my nails, sun low in the sky, I felt something close to peace. Not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. And I knew without any doubt that my life story hadn't been written by who left. It had been written by who stayed. Over time, I began to see how deeply Grandma Rose's influence reached beyond the walls of our yellow house. People I'd never met would sometimes stop me after school events. They introduced themselves quietly. They told me how she once listened when no one else would. How she explained medical things patiently. How she treated them like human beings, even when they made mistakes. Those conversations humbled me deeply. They reminded me that the mark you leave on the world is rarely built in big, showy moments. It's built in small moments most people never see. I carried that awareness into every part of my life. I became more careful with my words, more thoughtful before making judgments. I learned to pause before deciding, even when deciding was my job. Especially then. There were days when the work felt heavy. Papers. High. Stories filled with loss, fear, and anger. On those days I came home exhausted, wondering if being fair truly made a difference in a world that seemed endlessly broken. On one such evening, I opened the notebook randomly and found a single sentence underlined twice in Grandma Rose's careful handwriting. Being fair doesn't heal the whole world at once. It heals it one person at a time. I closed the book and sat back, letting the truth of those words settle deep inside me. The following week I was asked to mentor a group of new teachers. They were bright, excited, and impatient. I recognized myself in them from years earlier, before life had stripped away false certainty and left only what was real. I didn't lecture them with rules. I told stories about mistakes I'd made, about being patient, about the cost of being right without being kind. Some listened carefully, some didn't. Grandma Rose used to say that teaching was an act of faith. You never knew which seeds would grow. Inside of school, Oregon continued its quiet rhythms. Tourists came and left. The mountains stood tall under endless skies. Life moved forward without caring about personal victories or defeats. I found comfort in that. It reminded me that my story, though important to me, was part of something much bigger than myself. One afternoon, while sorting through old papers in the house, I found a photograph tucked between some bills. It showed Grandma Rose and Grandpa Henry standing in the garden. Their hands were held together. Both were smiling at something just out of view. I'd never seen this photo before. I stared at it for a long time. They looked peaceful, whole, complete. I placed the photograph next to the notebook on the shelf. Two forms of truth resting side by side. One written in ink, one captured in time. That night I dreamed of Grandpa Henry's laughter carried on the wind, soft and comforting. I woke with tears on my face, but also with gratitude. Some losses never stop hurting, but they also never stop teaching. As I got dressed for school the next morning, I caught my reflection in the mirror and paused. The woman looking back at me was no longer shaped by what she survived. She was shaped by what she chose to protect. And that, I realized, was exactly what Grandma Rose had been preparing me for all along. There was a quiet confidence that settled into my life after that realization. Not arrogance, not thinking I was always right, but an understanding of who I was at my core. I no longer felt the need to prove myself to anyone. Not to my coworkers, not to the town, and certainly not to my parents. Grandma Rose once told me that peace came when your actions matched your values, even if the world didn't understand you. I finally knew what she meant. One afternoon, while looking through old school files in the storage room, I came across a paper Grandma Rose had written decades earlier about caring for newborn babies. The handwriting was unmistakable, neat, calm, firm without being harsh. The paper talked about a young mother who made mistakes but learned from them. Her words balanced honesty with compassion. Reading it felt like hearing her voice again. I sat there longer than I needed to, letting the weight of her wisdom sink into me. That evening I went home and cooked one of Grandpa Henry's old recipes. It didn't taste exactly the same. Never did. But the act itself mattered. Stirring slowly, waiting patiently, letting warmth fill the room. Love, I had learned, could be practiced even when you were alone. My phone buzzed while I ate. A message from Mr. Robert Mills. He wrote that Grandma Rose's former co-workers were starting a small scholarship fund in her name. It would help students who wanted to work in nursing. They wanted my thoughts, not my money. My guidance. Smiled. That was exactly the kind of legacy she would have wanted. As spring turned into summer, Oregon felt alive again. The garden bloomed. The sunflowers Grandpa Henry planted years ago stood tall and strong. Their faces always turned toward the light. I spent more evenings outside, barefoot in the grass, watching the sky change colors as the sun set. Sometimes I thought about the girl I used to be. The child left behind without explanation. The teenager who learned too early that love could vanish. I wished I could tell her something now. I would tell her that being chosen later didn't mean she was unwanted before. I would tell her that the people who stayed mattered more than the ones who left. I would tell her that being fair, when practiced with kindness, could become a form of healing. I didn't know what the future held. Jobs change. Lives shift. Loss finds us again when we least expect it. But I knew this much. I would keep choosing honesty over shortcuts, kindness over bitterness, truth over comfort. Not because it was easy, but because it was right. And because two people who had every reason to turn away from a child left on their doorstep chose instead to stay, to love, and to prepare her for a world that would test her heart again and again. Carried them with me in every choice I made. The older I got, the more I understood that my story was never really about money, lawsuits, or even fairness in the legal sense. Those were just the frames around something far more personal. It was a story about choice. About what people do when love requires effort instead of convenience. Grandma Rose and Grandpa Henry were given a child who wasn't theirs and no obligation to keep her. Yet they chose to stay. They chose to raise me with patience, discipline, and a kind of love that didn't ask to be repaid. Everything I became grew from that choice. I still kept the notebook close. Not on display. Not as a symbol. But on a quiet shelf where it belonged. Sometimes after difficult days I would open it and read a page or two. Not looking for answers but for grounding. Grandma Rose never told me what to think. She taught me how to think. And more importantly, how to feel without letting feelings become cruelty. The town eventually stopped connecting my name with the lawsuit. Cases replaced old headlines. New conversations took over where whispers once lived. Oregon went back to being simply Oregon. Place of mountains, clean air, and long memories. I remained in the same yellow house. I kept the garden alive and growing. I continued my work, knowing that fairness practiced daily and quietly mattered more than any public victory ever could. Sometimes I wondered if my parents thought of me, if they regretted more than just the lawsuit, if they finally understood what they walked away from all those years ago. I didn't dwell on it. Realizations come too late to change outcomes, but not too late to change hearts. And that was enough. If you made it all the way to the end, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It means more to me than you'll ever know. Please like this video and share it if this story touched you in any way. I stand where I am today not because I won a case, but because I chose not to let bitterness decide who I would become. Grandma Rose once wrote that the truest measure of fairness isn't what we demand from others, but what we refuse to surrender inside ourselves. I never surrendered that. I chose kindness when anger would have been easier. I chose patience when revenge felt tempting. I chose to live in a way that honored the people who raised me. Not through perfection but through intention. And every single day that choice continues. For another story that fits your mood, click the video on the left. To hear our latest upload, choose the video on the right.